glad that you're here. It takes a lot of courage to stand with other people. There's brain research that they're starting to show how screen time is affecting the development of the brains of children. Now, that screen time is probably most likely a phone or a tablet, but as a kid that was raised by Bugs Bunny, I know how the screen can affect you. And I also know that we have an enemy who is relentlessly pursuing our children through those screens. And I know this because we have seen in the work that we do, children doing innocent searches for their favorite Disney character and getting back pornographic videos with either characters named after those characters or actually cartoons that use those characters in really awful ways. So those screens are affecting their development is what they're beginning to find. And it affected me. I did not develop those parts of my brain that were used for interacting with other people in a healthy way. I wasn't good at relationships, but I could watch the screen and I could interact with Bugs Bunny a whole lot better than I could with my wife. And that's a big part of why we're here, is that this affected my marriage long term. It affected my ability to communicate. And so over the last 24 plus years that we've been married, we've been doing an intensive search of what works and what doesn't. What is helpful, what's a distraction, what can actually cause more harm, and those kind of things. And we've healed our relationship, and I've healed my brain from some of the negative impacts of over-entertaining myself, for lack of a better term there. We're certified mentors in sexual integrity through an organization called Bravehearts. You may or may not have heard of them, but we've helped hundreds of men and couples through the work that we've been doing. We're going to give you some practical advice today on how to help people, especially your kids. Now, this can be your kids, your grandkids, your adult kids, kids that you happen to come into contact with in whatever ministry that you might do, that kind of thing. And while this is titled Internet Addictions or Screen Addictions, really my story wraps around pornography addiction. And so that's a big part of what we're going to talk about. And I in no way wanted to deceive you with saying internet addiction and then drag you in here to talk about porn, but pretty much pornography runs the internet, and we know that. But so that's a big part of what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to jump straight into my story. So I was 5 years old when I found a magazine in my dad's desk. That magazine had, 10 pictures of a naked woman in it. And that led to a 38-year relationship with pornography for me. And when I was 5, I had a secret. I knew I had a secret. Nobody had to tell me, don't talk about this. I just knew I shouldn't. And that secret led to me being a liar. A very consistent, very convincing liar. And shortly before I met Lori, I had been married before for 22 months. It was a really bad marriage. Pornography was a part of it, but it wasn't really active use. That marriage was such a mess that I didn't turn to that a whole lot. But right before Lori and I got married, the internet came online. I have a degree in computer science. I've had a computer since I was like 17. And I had a modem. I was getting things on computers that most people weren't getting at that time. But when I met Lori, I actually confessed to her, hey, look, I've got a problem with pornography. I'm really trying to fight this. And I think once we get married, I believe once we get married, this will no longer be a problem. And I was self-deceived in that because I kept thinking that pornography was mainly a sexual issue and not necessarily a relational issue. Something about how I could or couldn't relate to her and whether or not that was going to affect me long term. And so I said I became a liar. And in the 24 years almost that we've been married, I had some periods of sobriety, but in 2006, I had made Lori my accountability partner through a turn of events. And I told her in the morning, hey, look, if I have a problem with pornography today, I'll tell you about it tonight. And then I would come home that night and I'd say I didn't have any problem with pornography. And at some point, it became a lie. And I proceeded to lie to her for the next 4 years, almost every single night. And it still bothers me a lot. Anyway, I lied more than 1,000 times to her. And needless to say, when that came out, it didn't go well. And it took some time to fix that. And between 2010 and 2013-ish, we did a lot of the work to get things rebuilt. And then really by 2015, we had worked through all the last little bits. And I managed to rebuild my marriage. I managed to get her to trust me again after doing all of that. And I now have a marriage that I wouldn't have thought possible. You know, we have a marriage where sometimes we don't look at each other because we know we're about to burst out laughing over some inside joke between the two of us. A lot of them tend to happen in church environments. And so that's like the wrong time to sit there and go, you know. So it is possible, and the reason why I say this is for your children, if a few pictures when I was 5 years old took me on a 38-year journey that darn near destroyed my marriage, what is a 5-year-old going to see now when they accidentally find porn? What are they going to see now, and how is that going to affect them, and what kind of journey is that going to take them on? And one of the guys that we know real well through this whole organization, he says the 3 most dangerous places for a child: the school bus, the sleepover, and grandma's house. Grandma or grandpa. Because grandma or grandpa, they have the internet, but they don't, they just have the internet. Although a lot of my clients are in their 60s, so there's a possibility that grandpa's been using and their grandsons are getting exposed and they don't know it, or their granddaughters. But we will get into some of those. Yeah, you want to?
Well, my story in this all, I did know about Jay's screen addiction, we'll call it, because it wasn't just the pornography that affected us. It was also gaming and entertainment, that sort of thing. And even so I knew about that before we got married, really prayed about it, because to me, porn addiction is just one step shy of an affair. So I really debated on whether to get married and had a lot of miraculous signs and a lot of encouragement from other people saying, we think God is in this. And now I know that he was, because of what we're doing now. And so I took the leap of faith and got married, and we fought about it for 6 months. And then after that 6 months was over, he started having interest in other women at work. And I didn't know about this until probably 3 years later, where it started becoming a drip-fed confession, and that would last for the next probably, I don't know, until 15 years into our marriage. So by year 15, I thought, okay, I couldn't not talk about this with other women because it was so frightening to me. So I would talk to the other women about it, and well, not just them, but the messages I got back from all over the place were have more faith or you're being codependent. So over that course of 15 years, I really worked on having more faith and working on my codependency, and that really helped in a lot of other areas, like nearly every other area in my life besides this one. And so when I realized, okay, doing it the right way gave us this marriage that was on the brink of divorce, I've got to do it differently. So right after he confessed, at year 15, I was like, okay, God, if you want me to stay, we've got to do it differently. And I felt like he said, good. And so then we were on 4 or 5 year journey of finding the best practices to deal with this. And so we've kind of developed a program that's very, very effective with couples and especially wives, and on Jay's part, especially with men. But yeah, he has developed a relationship that I enjoy now too. I mean, I truly feel like I'm his one and only. If there's ever any doubt in my mind, I'm able to ask him about it, and we can actually talk about it now. But the thing I want you guys to realize, it wasn't just the porn, and this is what I want you to know for your daughters, especially when they become adults or when they start dating and they start having issues with maybe if they're boyfriends or husbands. If you think of the level of damage as a triangle, split it up into 3 parts. The first part is the porn or the screen addiction. Typically, in my case, it's the porn because I deal with ladies who've been betrayed. The second part is the lying. And what the women say is, I can take the porn, but I can't take the lying. And what I tell them is, you're actually stronger than you think. And she's like, what do you mean? I said, because you're staying. You can take the lying. And what I see is she can actually stay sane here. This, I'm going to call everything else. There's a whole other world of damage going on, because typically, if he stops the porn, the lying might continue, but he might blame her for it all. I've heard horror stories. Pastors might blame her for it. Therapists might blame her for it. This is where she starts going a little insane, a little to a lot insane. This is where she starts not being able to think straight anymore, okay? So when your adult daughters, if they ever come to you and say, my husband has this issue, please understand it's never just this issue. There's probably a hidden life going on. She's probably wondering, what else has he done? But even then, this part, your response can help her or be part of this everything else, and I'll get to a little bit of that in a minute. But I think now Jay is going to, well, on my end, this everything else is what nearly destroyed us, because I really needed to talk about it with him. And whenever I found my voice, that's when his anger came out, because no longer were things status quo. He couldn't control me in the normal ways anymore. So I think Jay's going to talk about how it affects kids at this point.
Yeah, and I do want to say that, after telling those 1,000 lies to Lori, I told the worst one when she confronted me, and that it was all her fault, that this was on her. And that's a pretty painful thing to hear. That's a pretty painful thing to try to come back from. And, it's only through God's grace, this whole thing about relentlessness, that God was relentless in helping us, and we'll talk more about that. But so that's our story. I know that that may not be what you're here for, but let's talk a little bit different about how this is seen on a cultural level by your kids, okay? 92% of kids, this was a study done in 2015, 92% of kids, which is, I think, 29 and under, they see pornography as positive or neutral, 92%. Only 8% of kids saw pornography as negative. Over half of those interviewed said that not recycling is a bigger issue than pornography. All right? So that you threw away a plastic bottle, oh no. You watch porn, whatever. Okay, so there, big difference there. 80% of children are repeatedly exposed to hardcore pornography. Age of exposure is happening at the age of 10 and younger. Because it's, oh, can I borrow your tablet? Can I see your phone? You know, and we hand it to our child, not thinking what could happen there. In fact, one of the best resources, I'm going to go ahead and mention it now, there's an organization called protectyoungeyes.com. All right, Protect Young Eyes is kind of an offshoot of the Covenant Eyes organization. It's run by a guy named Chris McKenna. And where was I going with this? 10 and turning younger, and no, that's what it was. So he put up a thing on the screen, and he said, okay, which of these apps are the most dangerous apps for your children to be on? Or, you know, out of these apps, which ones would you think are dangerous for your children to be on? And so they had Facebook, the weather app, and they had a Bible app, and then they had like something else. And nobody said, yeah, the Bible app's dangerous. And what he said was, that Bible app has a Google search engine in it, full access to the internet. So you're on the Bible app, and you switch over and do a search, and you get full-blown internet access from that app. So even if you shut down all the other stuff, you don't know some of these things about the app. So that's why Protect Young Eyes is such a great organization. They research all of these apps as they come out, and they start telling parents, hey, these are really important. What they also say is whatever app is popular with children is also very popular with predators. And he gave the example of some lip-syncing thing that teenage girls were into about singing along with their favorite pop star or whatever it was. And he said that other than teenage girls, it was really popular with adult men. And that should be kind of scary about what apps are your children putting on their phones, that kind of thing. He also advocates that there's not an age at which your child is ready for a phone or ready for Facebook or ready for any of those things. There's a set of behaviors that your child should evidence first before they're ready for that. Meaning, can they hold a conversation socially in person before they're being exposed to social situations online? Things like that. So there's quite a bit there that you'd want to look into. Protect Young Eyes is a great organization for dealing with children. They have a whole bunch of stuff in there that I really refer to. And so I'm going to turn this over to Lori now.
Okay, one more thing I want to say about Protect Young Eyes is it gives you a way to talk to the kids from any age, whether they're old, young, you know, preschool on up. So we're big proponents of that organization. How it affects girls. While girls can become addicts, in fact, that number, the percentage of women or girls who are becoming addicts is climbing, you would just use the same thing, you know, for male addicts, boy addicts with girls there. But the part I want to talk about is how it's normalizing sex acts. There was a saying a while back, a few years ago, that said like a certain sex act was the new goodnight kiss. And we've heard of stories where a guy will not hold her hand in public unless she performs for him in private. He will not give her any kind of affection or say, I love you, unless certain things happen first. And the girls are going along with it. I'm hoping that tide is turning, because that has been the norm for so long that I'm hoping that girls are saying, you know what, no more. And I hope that the older girls are now teaching the young girls, don't do it. So I'm hoping that tide is turning, but just understand this is the message that's getting across to the girls out there. We have heard horror stories, even with the clients because we work with the couples that are going through it, trying to help them rebuild their marriage and that sort of thing. But we've heard of horror stories for their kids through them on everything from screen to porn. And one of our clients said, I try to limit the amount of screen time my kids have, but then for a treat, I'll give them access to it on Saturdays if they've behaved well. And she says they are like monsters after that hour of gaming online. It's like I just overdosed them with sugar and caffeine. So that's just screen time playing games. We've heard of another one. We have an emotional extortion story to share with you. Another story we heard was this boy had gotten caught in kind of a compromising position. He was so ashamed and so shut down. His parents were like, we need to talk about this. Let's go back to therapy, and just talk this out. And he's like, I am not going to talk to you. I'm not going to acknowledge your presence until you give me this new gaming system. That's how kind of twisted these minds can get because porn is like, you don't have to do anything. I'm going to do everything for you. You don't even have to show up well at all. So it really can start messing with the kids' minds. And just as parents, what you guys need to understand is we heard a story of a doctor and lawyer, husband and wife team that both lost their practices because their son was sexting with his girlfriend on their devices or on their service. So they were the child pornographers. And they got slapped with that label and lost both of their practices. So it's definitely something to talk with your kids about. I think Jay's going to cover resources now. We've already covered Protect Young Eyes, and I don't know if that's protectyoungeyes.com or .org, but that's definitely a good one.
So real quick, I want to cover something, though. When a child comes to you, if a child comes to you and says, Dad, Grandpa, I came across this picture, I have no idea what to do. The best response is, I'm so sorry this happened to you. Okay, typically kids are not looking for what they're about to get themselves into. And that shame response is a big part of what most of the guys I deal with struggle so hard with shame. And so the first resource that guys need, because it is my belief, the antidote to shame is this: vulnerability and acceptance. The person who's feeling the shame, I now need to be vulnerable, because what shame keeps telling me is, if you tell the truth, they will all reject you. And the thing is, if I tell the truth and somebody says, oh, dude, I totally get it, I'm like, I'm not a freak? Somebody else understands? Awesome. Hey, here's more. So the very first resource that people need is an army. They need people to come around them and say, come on, man, we all got our struggles. I'll stand with you, you stand with me, whether it's porn, whether it's something else, that's okay. I still love you, I still accept you, you're not a freak in my eyes. All right? So Covenant Eyes is another great resource. Covenant Eyes is substantially changing what they're doing right now. They're doing a new thing called screen accountability. Screen accountability is going to start taking, snapshots off of the computer. So if it feels like, hey, you're on a porn site, it's going to take a snapshot of that, and it's going to fuzz it out, and then it's going to send it to your accountability partners. And they're going to say, let's talk about this, right? So that's kind of the next step in it, because there are all kinds of sites you can go to that are supposedly safe and yet have things on them that are not. There's a book out on the table called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. Meant kind of for little younger kids, but it can be for older, like 10, 12-year-olds kind of a thing. Out at the Shared Hope International, there's a guy named Jerry Webb. He has the exploitation table is right there. He's right there. He's got a parent's guide. So if you want even more in-depth and you don't want to write down all the places I'm mentioning, he mentions all of them except for Protect Young Eyes. For older teens, there are two really great resources, because when you're talking to teenagers nowadays, when you're talking to anybody that's under the age of like 25, first you got to make it cool, and then you got to make it scientific, all right, or relevant. Because they're more willing to listen to science than they are well, let me tell you what happened to me. They're more willing to listen to the science. So the first site is called Fight the New Drug. Fight the New Drug. And their catchphrase is porn kills love. And so they've got a whole bunch of stuff on there about that. There's another website, yourbrainonporn.org, I believe. And that guy's actually done brain scans of people who are addicted. And what he found is that porn-addicted brains and cocaine-addicted brains are very similar. The prefrontal cortex of our brain is the part that's responsible for compassion and consequence and creativity, all right? So 3 C's: compassion, consequence, creativity. This is the last part of the brain to develop in human beings, and for guys it doesn't develop until we're at least 25. So if you're ever like, why did my car insurance go down when I turned 25? It's because we finally realized that doing 102 might have a consequence. Anyway, but I don't think they knew that. I don't think they were like, hey, let's do a brain study. They're just like, okay, at what age do guys stop doing stupid stuff? And they figured out that it was like 25, 26, right? Although I'm kind of like, I'm one of those long tail guys. I'm like still out here at 50, and they're like, oh yeah, we got you. And then another real good resource, and she's actually, we met her here locally. I think she's based in Grand Rapids. Jen, Jenn, @war.com. Jenn@war.com. She's got a lot of good resources for therapy and that kind of thing for kids. So developing that army for men, developing that support system, is what I'm talking about. Getting them involved in a group. Celebrate Recovery typically talks about these. There's also stuff like Faithful and True or Proven Men. There's a lot of ministries like that. You can send them to me. My website is not subtle. It is called porniskillingme.com. My mom and my brother both said, porn's not really killing you. And I'm like, oh yeah? You know how many guys I've had come to me and say, you know how close I was to suicide? So this does affect men. 56% of all divorces cite too much porn use. Right? So when we talk about what's the plague, we talk about the plague of divorce is more than half of all marriages end in divorce. Half of all of those are citing porn use as a problem, or internet use, or whatever. And how deeply impacted is my family And tell me, guys, if you haven't seen this, you go to the restaurant, the whole family. You know, the food's on the table, they're all looking at their own separate screen. You know, and that's the screen addiction thing, but how long are you going to be on that screen before you're exposed to something that's even more addictive? Decreases men's effectiveness and increases the chances that they will abdicate their responsibilities in the family. They'll just be like, you know what, I'm going to go do my thing. I've got my man cave. I got my whatever. It impacts, I've had at least 3 clients come to me that have lost their jobs because of porn use. One of them is a pastor. All right? So it's affecting men in our church. There may be somebody in your church that you need to just say, hey, look, I'm not going to rat you out. But if you need to talk to somebody, come talk to me. And then, honestly, to me, one of the things that I talk about is living a bigger life. A life bigger than the screen in my hand or screen on my desktop, screen in my living room. That's a pretty small life of my using or not using life. I want to have a life that's really big. A life where relationships matter, where I'm connecting with other people, where I'm having an impact. And, you know, I can say I'm living that bigger life now. You know, I went from being a computer programmer and telling people how to do their jobs better to helping people have great marriages. That's awesome. The other part of this is that I can say that my wife is a better drug than porn for me. Meaning, she's my one and only. She's my best friend. And I didn't have that before. All right?
So how can this affect your daughter? I mean, Jay just covered how it can affect your sons as adults. 70 to 98% of the women who show up in therapy have clinical signs of PTSD from this. There's a book out there on the book table by Dr., I believe it's Daniel Amen, A-M-E-N. The lady who figured this out was a clinical therapist, had all these weird signs that betrayed wives were showing. She took it to one doctor who was doing it was an internal organ study, but it had to do with PTSD. And she took a look at that information and said, that's PTSD. She took it then to Dr. Amen. He took one look at it, and if you don't know anything about him, he is like one of the world's premier or foremost brain researchers. He does a lot of functional MRI scans and has been researching that for years. He took one look at the data and said, this is PTSD. And again, it's not just because of the screen addiction or the porn, it's mainly because of everything else that comes along with it. The inability to communicate, the blame shifting, that sort of thing. I've heard 5 therapists say on different occasions that the response from the women whose husbands have had actual affairs isn't much different than the response of women whose husbands are just involved in porn. I wouldn't have believed this until I had clients whose husbands had visited prostitutes, and they didn't act much different. Now, I mean, of course, physical affairs, if you get physical, then the wife is going to need to get tested, but it's almost like it rings our bell and we just sit there in a dazed state, because that's actually the way the nervous system works, but I wouldn't have believed it until I saw it with my own eyes. And again, the everything else could be in the form of a pastor doing more harm in what he says, maybe an uninformed response. I don't know how often that sort of thing happens, even in therapy sessions, but it happens often enough that there's a term for it, and that's called treatment-induced trauma. So be aware of that. But also, there's a term I've come up with called treatment-endorsed trauma, and that's where a woman can't trust her husband anymore. So she goes to therapy. She brings him to therapy. And then the therapist says something, oh, this is your codependency, this is with your anger issues. She has just given the husband license to go home and say the same thing and completely stop owning his own stuff, owning his own role in it, and put it all on her, saying, well, you're just being angry. Of course she's going to be angry. She's frustrated. She's afraid of, being homeless if this doesn't work out. She's frightened. It's going to come across as this alarmed intensity. And unfortunately, the way the brain in the minds of guys work, if they see something that may be just intensity, it's going to come across as anger because their brains are wired to see aggression. So she can be like, I am so afraid, I'm so in pain. He sees that and thinks it's anger. So hearing a therapist say that he has just gotten a license to kind of keep the family stuck for quite some time. There is a approach out there called the betrayal trauma model that works very, very well in addressing this issue in your daughters. When it first came out, people, or especially therapists, were saying it's just going to create victims. But what we found, the codependent model kept me stuck for 15 years. I can now get a woman through the first 2 phases of the trauma model and get her ready to take back her own life, to work with God, to get her happiness back, to get her joy back, and hopefully the guy will join her. I can get her there in about 4 months using the trauma model. It doesn't create victims, it actually creates victors. And the wife can actually be an agent of change, not just for the husband, but for the family too, for the kids too. Resources for your adult daughter. First of all, you. The way you respond can make all the difference in the world. Non-helpful responses, have more faith, you're being codependent. At least it's not blank is another one. If you find yourself saying at least it's not, then just halt yourself. One of the best responses I ever received was, oh, that's gotta hurt. I'm so sorry. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy. That was the first person to tell me I wasn't crazy. Everybody else kind of had measured responses. What else you can do? You can help them come up with plan A and plan B and plan C and plan D and on and on. And the reason I say that, if she thinks, hey, we're going to go to this, he's enrolled in CR, or he's going to go to this men's group, and that doesn't work, if she doesn't have a plan B, she can then feel frozen again. When she knows that there are options, lots of options, more than 2 options, her mind isn't stuck anymore. And then she can keep from going to the PTSD side of things. You can reach out to us, porniskillingme.com for him, and mine is called His Porn, Your Pain Healed, or pornpainhealed.com for the women. Apsats.org, apsats.org is, I always have to think about this, the Association of Partners of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists. They're who I got my trauma training through, my betrayal trauma training. There's a whole list of therapists that are betrayal trauma trained that could help your daughter. Keep in mind traditional approaches. This was a study done for male addicts, male porn addicts. I would say possibly screen addicts. It might even be a little less effective, just because a screen is socially acceptable. But what they found, this was a study done by Califano, Blankenship, and one other guy that I can't remember his name, but they're 2 therapists. What they found was traditional approaches are about 3% effective for guys and have about a 70% dropout rate. The mentorship we've seen is about 50% or greater in helping guys. What we've seen, it's about 80% effective and probably about 95% effective in keeping the family together. And I think it's because we do take a non-traditional approach to it. We really meet them where they are. You can't really be a mentor unless you've lived it. So right off the bat, the people. There's a relatability there. But even still, anything is better than nothing. As long as, again, they have plan A, and do a plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D for your sons as well, because they need to know that this is a difficult thing to beat. Did you already bring up the heroin? We've had guys that we've run into that said, I was a heroin addict, I was a cocaine addict, and even though those were difficult, those were easy to beat compared to this. So even your sons need to have a lot of things in the wings if the first one doesn't work out. I think that's all I have.
So hopefully this wasn't too overwhelming for you, but it might have been. We have a sign-up sheet up here. If you sign up, we'll let you know about events going forward. You're going to be basically signing up on our email list if you're interested. If you have any questions, we have about 4 minutes, I think, before we're supposed to wrap up. But I guess we can be done at this moment. Thank you so much for coming in. Yeah, what was your question?
And so whenever I kind of bring up this topic with my wife, I don't think she fully understands the risks that go along with this. And when I want to force kind of guardrails, there's not really, she thinks it could be either like that, I'm doing something wrong, or that why don't I have enough strength on my own. And so I want to know some suggestions on how to communicate with this topic with my wife.
Okay, so just to be clear, your question is basically, how do I tell my wife that while I'm not struggling now, I want to put some controls in place to help me not struggle in the future without setting her down a negative path? Right.
I would say definitely have a plan, like have a plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. You can do those things on your own. But what I would tell her is society is trying to turn me into a voyeur. It's not like a chemical addiction. Imagine if every time you saw a billboard and you were trying to recover from a chemical addiction, every time you saw a billboard, one of those kind of billboards or one of those kind of magazine covers, somebody came up and gave you a little shot of your chemical. You're not going to recover. So, and that's because sex sells. So society is trying to turn us into voyeurs. They're trying to turn us into addicts. They're trying to keep us there. So I would kind of maybe go from that standpoint and just reassure her, look, I will give you keys to my kingdom. I will give you access to everything. I want to give that to you. In fact, we can meet afterwards. We have you want to clean DNS? Yeah, there's some things you can put on that will cover your whole house versus just things that are connecting through the Wi-Fi. I don't even, he's a technological guy, but anyway, we can give you something, but just let her know, I just want to be above board, and the more I know that I can't deceive anything, the more I'm an open book, the more I'm going to remain with you, my one and only. And I want to keep you that way. You are that way. I want to keep you that way. Unfortunately, we live in a world now where they don't want me to stay that way. So what can we put into place? Right.
Yeah, one part of my story I didn't tell is before that 4-year period of lying to her every night, I was clean for 6 years. I stayed away from it for 6 years. And then I was just back into it. And there's some reasons behind that and so on, but this is one of those things that can creep back in pretty easily because it is so easily accessible. But Protect Young Eyes has an article on there, how to block porn on any device for free. Okay, and that gets into this whole technical and it breaks it all down, but he does a really good job of explaining it. So again, Protect Young Eyes is a great resource.
And another thing we can give you is a really quick tool. It takes about 5 minutes, and it's just something that we give to couples so that within 5 minutes they feel connected. He's staying on board with his sobriety. She knows about it. But it's more than that. It's like developing the relationship instead of kind of just sin management. Okay.
I think that's it, guys. Thank you so much for your time. If you do have any questions or you want to sign up, please feel free to stick around. Thank you so much.